Hello, friends. Before we begin, let me wish you a warm and sincere Christmas wherever this day finds you, whether you're sitting at a crowded table filled with laughter and family, or alone with nothing but your thoughts and the quiet crackle of a fire. Know this: you are welcome here. I'm grateful you've chosen to be part of this circle. What we've built together is rare now, a place for people who still believe that stories can mend something broken, carry us across time, and remind us of the strength we forget we have. So thank you for listening, for staying, for believing. Today's story belongs to this season, not because of snow or celebration, but because it speaks of a miracle that only happens when two lost souls collide in the dark. This is a story about endurance, about storms that try to claim us and the hands that reach through chaos to pull us back. If it settles somewhere in your chest, I hope you'll say so. For now, let's step away from the glow of holiday lights and ride back to the harsh, unforgiving heat of the Arizona territory. In the summer of 1888, the old ones called it the Thunder Moon. In those narrow slot canyons where the land splits open like an old scar, the air changes long before rain ever falls. It thickens, clings to the skin, pressing hot and heavy against the lungs. The smell comes first. Ozone crushed, sage damp stone. The birds know. They always know. Hawks abandon the sky. Jays fall silent in the scrub oak, and a stillness settles in that feels nothing like peace. Koda stood at the edge of a limestone rim, letting that silence roll through him. He understood the sky better than he understood men. At 32, he moved with the quiet certainty of a seasoned Apache tracker, but he no longer followed army trails, and he no longer hunted for blood. He had walked away from the scouts, the reservations, and the soaked red history of the territory. Now he lived in what the elders called a blind canyon, a hidden fold of stone unseen on any map, leading nowhere except inward. To rock, to solitude, to a stranger who might never come. From a distance he might have looked alone, a dark outline against a sky bruised purple by the coming storm. But Koda wasn't lonely. He was worn down, the kind of exhaustion that sinks deeper than muscle and bone. It lived in his shoulders, heavy with memory, and in the etched lines framing his mouth. He carried too many years of following ghosts. Too many graves dug for men who died for lies. If you studied his eyes, dark, alert, impossibly deep, you wouldn't see a man, barely past 30. You'd see someone who had lived a lifetime too long. He watched storm clouds stack high along the northern horizon, massive slabs of gray and black lit from within by silent flashes. He didn't fear them. Storms were honest. They didn't pretend. They didn't promise mercy. Koda turned toward his shelter, a stone dwelling carved into the cliff face, safely above flood reach when the sound reached him. Not thunder, not wind, something sharper, wrong. A frantic scream carried on the shrill whinny of a horse, followed by the sick crack of breaking wood. Koda froze. He pivoted toward the rim and looked down past red rock walls into the winding throat of Arroyo del Diablo, the Devil's Wash. Most days it was nothing but dust and smooth stones, a path for lizards and scorpions. But Koda knew the desert's cruelty. A storm miles away could turn a dry channel into a grave in seconds. He stepped closer. The canyon floor was already changing. A deep vibrating roar filled the air below like a freight train tearing through the earth. The stench of wet clay and ancient dust surged upward, and then he saw her. A flash of pale blue against the canyon's burning red. A woman. She was trapped at the bottom of the wash, separated from her horse. Belle had already fled for higher ground. She stood on a narrow shelf of rock, clutching a twisted ironwood root jutting from the cliff wall. Koda's gaze sharpened. He could read the terror in her body, the rigid spine, the white-knuckled grip. She stared upstream, frozen in the instant before understanding. From her angle, she couldn't see what Koda could. What was racing toward her wasn't just water. It was a wall, a boiling mass of mud and debris, ripped trees and boulders as large as wagons. A flash flood, charging through the canyon like a collapsing mountain. When it hit, nothing survived. The woman, Clara Whitlow, was caught with nowhere to climb. The canyon walls rose sheer and unforgiving, and the water was already circling her boots, dark and hungry. 10 seconds. Maybe less. That wall would crush her against stone or drag her screaming into blackness. Another soul claimed by the river Koda didn't let the thought finish. The tired part of him, the part that wanted to turn away from the world and its endless trouble, vanished. What remained was instinct, purpose, the tracker. What remained was the tracker, the guardian. Koda didn't shout, his voice would have vanished beneath the roar anyway. He let the bundle of firewood fall, brushed his fingers against the knife at his belt, and committed himself to the descent. The cliff face was nearly sheer, but he moved without hesitation, not like a man driven by fear, but like one who understood he was the final barrier between a stranger and death. Above him, the storm finally broke. Thick drops of rain struck the dust like scattered gunfire. Koda saw nothing but the woman in blue and the wall of water charging straight for her. Down in the throat of Arroyo del Diablo, sound no longer traveled. It attacked. It crushed. The noise carried weight. The canyon trembled, the vibration shaking bone and breath alike. Koda didn't run. He flowed. He slid down the rock with deliberate risk, reading the sandstone the way other men read a trail. His boots skidded across slick shale, spraying grit that vanished instantly into the rising wind. Below, the riverbed was mutating. The first surge of the flood writhed forward, churning violently. Brown water frothed as it clawed at scattered boulders, but behind it came the real terror. A solid wall of dark water, thick with torn mesquite and jagged timber, rounded the bend. It roared like a derailed freight train. Clara Whitlow couldn't scream. Her throat locked tight, clogged with dust, and the overwhelming scale of the terror bearing down on her. She was pinned against the red stone boots, sliding uselessly on slime-coated rock. The water had already climbed to her knees. It tugged at her heavy skirts as if 1,000 hands were dragging her downward. Her fingers blanched, locked around the twisted ironwood root jutting from the cliff face. It was all that kept her upright. And it was failing. She heard it, the sharp crack slicing through the thunder of water. The wood groaned, stretching fibers snapping one by one. She lifted her eyes, searching desperately for salvation. For God. For anything. What answered was a shadow falling from the sky. Koda landed on a ledge, 10 feet above her, and never stopped moving. He dropped the remaining distance moccasins, gripping a sliver of stone barely wide enough for a mountain goat. For a single heartbeat, time faltered. Clara stared into the face of the man who seemed to have descended from the storm itself. His skin was dark hair pulled back with a strip of leather. His face streaked with canyon dust. In the drawing rooms of Boston, she'd heard stories. Stories of Apaches as monsters, as ghosts, as savages who killed without blinking. Panic struck hard and cold in her chest, mixing with the terror of the flood. She recoiled instinctively, her grip loosening. Koda saw it immediately. The look in her eyes was one he knew well, the gaze of a trapped creature choosing between fire and the cliff. But there was no time for gentleness, no time for names or permission. The flood was 50 yards away, 40. The ironwood root gave one last mournful creak and tore free. Clara slipped. The current seized her waist, wrenching her sideways, dragging her toward the oncoming debris. Koda lunged. He didn't take her hand. He caught her wrist. His fingers closed around her skin with absolute certainty, not painful, but unbreakable. Iron wrapped in velvet. A grip that promised, "I have you, and I won't let go." Up he shouted, his voice cracking through the chaos like thunder. He didn't wait. He hauled her upward, bracing himself against the rock, using his own body as leverage. Her soaked skirts dragged like stone boots, scrambling uselessly until suddenly she was rising, weightless for a breath. lifted clear of the river's teeth. For a heartbeat she hung in the air, suspended above the boiling death below. Then they cleared the waterline just as the blow came. The full crest of the flood smashed into the canyon wall, striking the exact place where Clara Whitlow had stood only a second earlier. The impact shuddered through the rock itself. Water and grit blasted upward, icy and brutal, soaking them both. The sound was biblical boulders, grinding tree trunks, snapping the river, screaming as it reclaimed what had always been its own. Koda did not slow. He hauled her higher, dragging her onto a broader limestone shelf tucked beneath a protective overhang, far above the reach of the killing current. He pressed her gently but firmly against the stone and stood in front of her, chest rising hard. His eyes never stopped moving, tracking the flood below, gauging the water's height, measuring danger. Time stretched. Long seconds passed. Neither of them spoke. There was only the roar of the river and the harsh, uneven sound of their breathing. Then, almost as suddenly as it had come, the violence began to loosen its grip. The storm, true to the nature of the high desert, moved on. Rain softened to a mist, then faded altogether. Thunder drifted south, muttering like a wounded animal denied its kill. Below them, the flood still raged, swollen and furious, but the climb of the water had slowed. The worst had passed. The quiet that followed felt unnatural, heavy with aftermath. Clara sagged against the rock, drawing her knees tight to her chest. As the adrenaline drained away, the cold rushed in. Shock followed in rolling waves. Her teeth began to chatter, sharp, uncontrollable clicks she couldn't stop. She hugged herself, but her dress was drenched, plastered to her skin like ice. She lifted her eyes to the man standing guard at the ledge's edge. He faced the canyon watchful. But at the sound of her shivering, he turned. His face revealed nothing old, unreadable, carved from restraint. But his eyes were different. They were not cruel. They took in the tremor in her limbs, the bluish tint creeping into her lips. Without speaking, Koda reached for the fastenings of his vest. It was buckskin worn, supple by years of use, kept dry beneath the shelter of stone. He pulled it free, revealing a linen shirt beneath damp with rain and sweat, and held the vest out to her. Clara hesitated. She studied the garment, then the hand offering it, dark, steady, strong enough to have dragged her back from oblivion. Every warning she had ever been taught whispered at once, "Don't trust them. Don't let them close." Then she glanced at the river below. She remembered the root snapping, remembered the grip that hadn't released. Her hand shook as she reached out and accepted the vest. She wrapped it around her shoulders. It was heavy and startlingly warm, holding the heat of his body. As she pulled it close, a scent rose around her. Not fear, not savagery. Wood smoke, crushed pine, rain striking hot stone, the smell of earth itself. Clara looked up at him over the buckskin collar. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely there. Koda answered with a single nod, brief, precise. He sat on the stone across from her, leaving space between them, giving her room to breathe, to tremble, to live. "The water moves fast," he said quietly. His voice was deep, unexpectedly gentle, shaped by a man who spoke English fluently, but chose each word with care. "But stone has patience," he said. "So we wait here and there." They remained on the narrow shelf above the river of lost souls. As the scent of rain thinned and wood smoke settled around her, something quiet took shape between them. The first bridge between their worlds was built not through language, but through warmth. Below, the flood of Arroyo del Diablo still tore through the canyon, a brown artery of violence carving the earth. Koda never glanced down. His attention stayed on the climb ahead. He guided Clara Whitlow not toward the rim, but inward into the rock itself. There were handholds carved into the sandstone, old ones, shaped centuries earlier by people who had vanished long before the first Spanish boot ever pressed this land. Koda moved as if the stone remembered him. He placed her shaking hands and feet with care, steadying her with a patience that contradicted the chaos they had fled. They climbed until the roar of the river softened into a distant, steady pulse. Then they rounded a corner, behind a massive slab of fallen limestone, and the world shifted. It was not a cabin, not a tent. It was a refuge carved straight from living stone, tucked beneath a broad overhang, shielded from wind and rain. A stone dwelling, an old ruin left behind by the ancient Pueblo people who once built entire cities into cliffs. Flat stones mortared with clay formed the walls, enduring and silent. Koda had not claimed this place by force. He had simply accepted its shelter. He'd mended the roof with juniper poles and adobe, hung heavy buffalo hides across the entrance, and swept centuries of dust from the floor. He pulled the hide aside and motioned her inside. Sit. It wasn't an order. It was permission to stop fighting for breath. Clara collapsed onto a bed of furs near the rear wall. The space was dim lit only by gray daylight, filtering through a smoke hole above. Once she was still, the weight of what she had lost came crashing down. Her mare Belle, gentle and bay-colored, was gone. Either swept away or lost to the wilderness. Her saddlebags were gone. Her food, her canteen, and her portfolio. The thought struck her chest with a hollow ache. Months of work, watercolors of desert verbena, charcoal sketches of narrow canyons, botanical studies meant to buy her freedom, were now grinding into mud at the bottom of the Devil's Wash. She stared at her hands. They were empty except for one thing clutched tight against her chest. Her fingers were locked in panic around a small battered leather case no larger than a Bible stained with water and grit. She hadn't let go, not when Belle reared, not when the flood struck, not when Koda hauled her up the cliff. It was all that remained of her life before the river. Koda moved quietly through the shadows. He struck a match, the sharp flare of sulfur briefly lighting his angular cheekbones and the focused intensity in his eyes. He kindled a small fire in the center pit, feeding it with dried greasewood. Flames rose, casting a warm amber glow that pushed the darkness back against the stone. The room warmed quickly, filling with the scent of ancient dust, sweet grass, and cured leather. He set a small iron pot over the fire and filled it from a clay jar. Then he turned toward her. He saw how she was curled around the leather case. He didn't ask what it held. He didn't ask about her horse. His gaze went only to her hands, scraped raw knuckles torn from stone. Her palms were scraped raw knuckles, split and bleeding, where she had clung to the ironwood root. Koda stepped toward her. Clara Whitlow recoiled, shrinking back into the furs. Old stories whispered at the edge of her mind. Boston parlor tales of scalps and savagery of men without mercy. Koda stopped. He didn't lift his hands in surrender. He didn't advance. Instead, he lowered himself, easing down until he no longer towered over her. He made himself smaller, and he waited. He waited until her breath caught and then slowed. Waited until she truly looked at his face. There was no hunger there, no cruelty, only a quiet, unsettling competence. "Your hands," he said softly. "The stone takes its due." He reached forward but did not seize her. He turned his palms upward, calloused and scarred, and held them still, waiting for her to choose. Slowly, Clara loosened one hand from the battered leather case. Her fingers trembled as she placed them in his. The contact startled her. She had braced for roughness, for the grip of a fighter. Instead, she felt something far more disarming, a gentleness so deliberate it nearly frightened her. The careful touch of a man who understood how easily life could break because he had watched it shatter too many times. Koda took a clean cloth, dipped it into warm water, and began washing the grit from her cuts. His movements were steady, precise, almost ritual. He said nothing. The cave held the silence for him. When he finished, he returned to the fire. He poured steaming water into a tin cup and added a pinch of dried leaves from a small pouch at his belt. "Drink," he said, handing it to her. "Green ephedra. It will calm the shaking. Clara cradled the cup in both hands, letting the heat sink into her stiff fingers. She took a careful sip. The taste was bitter, earthy, unmistakably wild. It tasted like desert rain. Her gaze drifted around the shelter, the clean order of it, the weapons stacked neatly in one corner, bundles of drying herbs hanging from the ceiling. And this man who moved like a shadow would get tended wounds with a care that felt almost maternal. "You speak English," she said. Her voice came out rough, scraped raw by a scream she'd never let loose. Fluently, Koda replied. He settled back on his heels, feeding another stick into the fire. "I scouted for the army. Under General Rowan Hale," he said. "They taught me their words so I could help them find what they couldn't see." Clara frowned. "And now I stopped finding things for them." She studied him, unsettled. A man who could descend a cliff in a storm, who lived among ruins, yet spoke with the measured cadence of someone educated. A sudden urgency rose in her to explain herself, to justify why she was here. I had a map," she said, staring into the flames. "The agent in Tucson, Ezra Pike, he told me this route was safe. He said this land was empty." Koda went still. Firelight reflected in his eyes, dark pools that seemed to hold the memory of the canyon itself. He looked at the stone walls around them, walls that had once held families, prayers, dreams older than Clara's bloodline. Then he glanced toward the vast quiet beyond the doorway. "This land is never empty," Koda said, his voice low, a rumble rising from deep within the earth. "It's full of bones, and stories, and spirits that haven't gone to sleep." He looked at her, then really looked, seeing fear and resolve tangled together in her chest. "It's just quiet," he finished. "You have to learn the difference." Clara said nothing. She drank the tea. Warmth spread through her. Outside, the last growl of thunder faded into the distance. The quiet closed in around them, inside the stone refuge. Only then did Clara Whitlow truly understand how far she was from civilization. Miles removed, stripped of nearly everything she owned. She was sitting in a cave beside a man she had been taught to fear. Yet as she watched Koda shape a piece of wood in the firelight, his hands steady, certain, another realization settled over her for the first time in her life. Among the ruins of the forgotten, she felt safe, completely safe. 2 days slipped by inside the stone sanctuary. Time in the blind canyon didn't answer to clocks. It moved with the angle of sunlight crawling across sandstone and the slow measured rhythm of Koda's work. Clara rested on the furs healing from bruises and shock, and she watched him. She couldn't help herself. In Boston, men were armored, stiff collars, polished shoes, gold watch chains, and words built to keep the world at a distance. Koda was nothing like that. He was silence made visible. She watched him peel bark from ironwood, his knife gliding with a smoothness that mimicked water over stone. She watched him scrape a deer hide stretched tight on a frame, his shoulders rolling in a tireless, hypnotic cadence. He was efficient. He was dangerous. Yet in the small, firelit space, he was also profoundly calm. An old ache stirred in Clara's fingers. The need to capture, to understand. Her portfolio was gone, swallowed by Arroyo del Diablo. But inside the battered leather case, the one thing she had saved were papers. Legal papers. Affidavits. Heavy cream-colored bond. When Koda stepped outside to check his snares, Clara reached to the fire pit and pulled free a piece of charcoal. It crumbled black against her skin. She turned over one document, a petition for power of attorney, and on the blank reverse side she began to draw. She traced the curve of his jaw, the heavy brow, shadowing eyes far older than his years. She didn't draw the warrior others imagined. She drew the man who had brewed her tea, who had wrapped her in his own vest. When Koda returned, the sun was sinking, staining the canyon walls purple and red. He carried fresh water and the scent of evening air, then settled near the fire. For a long while, the only sound was greasewood crackling. "You look better," he said quietly. "The gray's gone from your face." Clara glanced down at her hands still smudged with charcoal. The fear, as she admitted. At least, the fear of the water. Koda stirred the coals. "But you're still afraid. Not of this canyon. Of what you left behind." It wasn't a question. It was a trail being read. Clara's grip tightened around the leather case. For 2 days, she had guarded it like a child guards treasure. Now, facing the man who had pulled her back from death without asking payment or praise, the dam inside her broke. "They told me I was sick," she whispered. The words felt strange in open air. "My stepfather, Silas Whitlow. He never struck me, never locked me away. He was far more civilized than that." Koda watched her unmoving, listening with the focused stillness of a predator. "He called it nervous hysteria," Clara went on, her voice strengthening. "Because I wouldn't marry his business partner. Because I wanted to paint. To study botany. To control what my mother left me." She tapped the leather case. "These aren't love letters. They're commitment orders." Her voice dropped. "He was going to put me in an asylum, Koda. A place with barred windows and quiet corridors," Clara said, "where they drug you until you forget your own name. He was going to bury me alive so he could take the money." She lifted her head, eyes burning now, not with fear, but with fury. "I didn't get lost, Koda. I ran." Her voice hardened. "I stole a horse. I took the only proof I had that I wasn't insane, and I ran until there was nowhere left to run." She waited for judgment, for him to tell her she was reckless, or weak, or that she should crawl back to the family that had tried to erase her. Koda stared into the fire instead. A shadow crossed his face, memory sharp and old. "The army," he said quietly. His voice was rough, scraped from somewhere deep. "They liked my eyes. Liked that I could read the ground like a newspaper. They called me a scout. Gave me a uniform. A wage." He turned his hand over, studying the thick calluses. "They said they knew what was best for my people. Drew lines on maps and told us live here, stay here, be civilized." He looked up, firelight cutting planes into his face. "They didn't use bars, Clara. They used promises. And when we didn't fit inside their lines, they called us savages." Their eyes locked, and something between them snapped tight and true. "Men who believe they own the world," Koda said, "always try to cage what they can't control. A woman who thinks for herself. Or a man who remembers the old songs." A shiver ran through Clara, but it wasn't cold. It was the shock of being understood. In Boston's velvet rooms, surrounded by polite voices and smiling threats, she had been suffocating. Alone. Here inside a stone cave that smelled of smoke and hides, sitting across from a man the world called dangerous. She had never felt safer. Clara reached for the paper beside her. I drew you," she said quietly. Koda stiffened. In his world, images could steal a piece of the soul. He hesitated, then extended his hand. Clara passed him the sheet. It was a rough sketch, charcoal burned from wood, drawn on the back of a legal writ that had tried to declare her unfit. The lines were raw but sure. It showed Koda by the fire. Not the scout, not the survivor the world feared. She had drawn the tilt of his head as he checked the water pot. The exhaustion etched into his eyes. The care in his hands. She had drawn him not as he was seen, but as he was. Koda studied the image for a long time. His thumb traced the charcoal lines, carefully guarding against smudge. All his life he had been looked at with fear, with hatred, with curiosity, but never truly seen. When he lifted his gaze to Clara, the ancient weariness in his face cracked just slightly, letting light through. "You have a gift," he murmured. "I only draw what I see," Clara replied. Koda handed the paper back, his fingers brushing hers. The touch sparked steadying electric like a grounding wire dropped into the storm of their lives. "Most people," he said thickly, They see the wolf, the teeth. He met her eyes fully now. You see the wolf, he said softly, but you drew the man. And in the silence that followed, the canyon no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like home. The silence of the blind canyon broke not with sound, but with light. It was mid-morning now. The sun had climbed high, burning the last damp breath of the storm from the air. Koda stood on the upper rim, nearly 100 feet above the stone dwelling, testing the wind. He watched a red-tailed hawk spiral upward on a rising thermal, effortless sovereign. Then he saw it, a flash on the valley floor, miles out, sunlight striking metal. It wasn't quartz, it moved. Koda froze. He dropped into a crouch, dissolving into the shape of juniper and shadow. His vision tightened, sharp as glass. 3 riders. They picked their way through the drying mud of the wash, slow and deliberate, heads bent toward the ground. Tracking. A cold weight settled in his gut. These weren't wanderers, not lost cowboys. Their movement was too clean, too intentional. The lead rider wore a long, dust-coated duster and sat a horse far too fine for this hard country. A rifle rested across his saddle, not holstered. Hunters, recovery men, paid by wealthy hands back east to reclaim what they believed belonged to them, whether bonds land or people. The 2 riders flanking him moved like wolves, trackers, men who could read the story of a woman clawing her way out of a flood. Koda backed away from the rim and descended fast, trading silence for speed. When he entered the stone shelter, Clara Whitlow was sorting her drying papers. She looked up, a faint smile touching her mouth, then it vanished when she saw his face. They're here, Koda said. His voice carried no panic, only weight. Clara rose too quickly. Papers slid from her lap and fluttered to the floor. Who? 3 men, he answered. 1 professional agent, 2 trackers. They found your boot prints in the wash. They're less than an hour out. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and brittle. He found me, she whispered. Silas Whitlow never stops. Her gaze darted around the stone walls to the entrance, as if the sanctuary were already closing in. Refuge had become a snare. Koda stepped closer. He didn't touch her, but his presence steadied the air firm as bedrock. Clara, listen to me. He pointed toward the rear of the dwelling, where a narrow fissure split the rock face. There's a chimney climb back there. Tight, but it leads to the upper mesa. From there, a goat trail runs north to Chloride. You could reach a train by morning. He met her eyes, dark and intent. I can draw them away, give you time. You can run. It was the logical answer, the safe one. Clara stared at the crack in the stone, at her battered leather case. She imagined the train whistle, the city's noise, men like her stepfather, men who used law and medicine to bind women tighter than iron. Then she looked at Koda, the man who had pulled her from the flood, who had cleaned her bleeding hands, who had looked at her drawing and seen a soul, not a sickness. If she left, she would be safe. But she would be alone, and she would still be running. Clara Whitlow turned back toward him, her chin lifted, the tremor in her hands stilled. No, she said. Koda blinked, caught off guard. They're armed, Clara. They're not coming to talk. I know, she answered, her voice hardening. But if I run now, I'll be running forever. I'll spend my life looking over my shoulder. I'm done with that. She stepped closer to him. This is your home. And for 2 days, it's been mine, too. I won't let them take it. Koda studied her face. He saw the fear, yes. But beneath it, he saw the same ironwood resolve he'd felt in the flood. She was holding fast. A slow, fierce pride sparked in his chest. Then we stay, he said. And we make them regret coming here. They didn't wait. This wouldn't be a street gunfight. This was Apache ground. Koda fought with the land itself. He moved along the narrow trail leading to the dwelling, shifting stones, brushing away prints, crafting a false line that veered toward a loose scree slope, deadly if followed at speed. Clara didn't hide. She opened her leather case, pushing past legal papers and jewelry. Wrapped in oilskin were her botanical tools, vials, mounting fluids, chemical powders meant to preserve fragile blooms. She pulled free a jar of magnesium powder and a small pouch of potassium chlorate, compounds used to fix color in desert flowers. She knew her chemistry. Mixed together, they weren't preservatives. They were flash powder, the same volatile blend photographers use to turn night into day. Her hands shook as she combined the gray dust into small parchment packets, threading each with a twisted cotton fuse. "You said they have horses," she told Koda when he returned. He nodded, checking the load in his Winchester. "Narrow trail. Single file." "Horses panic," Clara said, pressing 2 packets into his hand. "If they can't see, they can't fight." Koda glanced at the strange powder, then at her. A rare smile cut across his face, sharp and approving. "You are full of surprises, Clara Whitlow." "I told you," she replied, lifting a heavy length of driftwood like a club. "I'm a scientist." They took their places. Koda climbed to a rocky perch above the trail. Clara melted into the shadows near the dwelling's entrance, the bait. They waited. Hoofbeats reached them long before the riders appeared, echoing through the canyon. Clop, clop, clop. The rhythm of approaching violence. The lead man emerged first, a broad-shouldered agent, sweat darkening his duster. His eyes raked the cliffs with hungry intent. "Tracks end here," one of the trackers called Cole Maddox, reading the ground like scripture. "She's in that ruin." The agent laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "End of the line, darling," he shouted upward. "Come on out, Clara Whitlow. Your father is very concerned about your health." Clara didn't answer. She pressed her back to the cold stone heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird. The riders urged their horses up the steep, narrow path. The animals balked, eyes rolling, sensing danger. They were packed tight, exactly where the trap needed them. The trail narrowed to nothing, cliff falling away on one side, sheer stone on the other. They were exactly where Koda wanted them, high, exposed. Koda struck a match and touched it to the cotton fuse of the first packet. He released it. The small white bundle drifted downward, silent as ash landing on the rock shelf between the lead horse's front hooves. The agent glanced down. "What the—" There was no blast of metal. There was light. A violent bloom of white brilliance tore through the shaded canyon, blinding, searing, absolute, brighter than noon sun, brighter than lightning, tearing the sky. The horses screamed. The lead mount reared eyes, useless terror taking control. The agent lost his stirrups, clawing for balance as the animal bucked backward, slamming into the horse behind it. "My eyes," Grant Heller screamed, clutching his face. "I can't see." The ledge exploded into chaos. Horses panicked. Men shouted. Discipline collapsed into dust and hooves and blind terror. From his perch above, Koda didn't fire. He watched, rifle steady, waiting. As the magnesium smoke thinned, Clara Whitlow stepped from the shelter. She shielded her eyes against the fading glare and saw the men who had hunted her reduced to the staggering, shouting wrecks, fighting their own mounts to avoid plunging into open air. In that moment, she understood something fundamental. Power wasn't only law or money. Power was knowing the land. Power was standing your ground. And this fight wasn't finished. The smoke drifted away on the canyon breeze, revealing the ledge again. Grant Heller had found his footing. His face burned red with fury and humiliation. Limestone dust coated his expensive coat. His hat hung crooked. But he was still dangerous. In his hand, steady now, was a heavy Colt revolver. He didn't aim it at Koda. He aimed it at Clara. "Enough games." Heller roared, his voice cracking off the canyon walls. "You think a little flash powder changes the law? That woman is a ward of the state of Massachusetts. She's property of the Whitlow estate," he snarled. and I'm taking her back. Clara stood in the doorway, knuckles white around the driftwood club. She didn't retreat, but she felt the cold reach of the gun 30 yards away. Koda moved. He didn't reach for the Winchester on his back. He didn't draw the knife at his belt. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely between the gun and the woman. He walked down the slope with slow, deliberate steps, each one heavy with intent. He stopped 10 paces from the agent, relaxed, balanced hands open at his sides. Heller sneered, though the revolver wavered just slightly. He took in Koda's buckskins, his posture the unmistakable bearing of a former scout, and made a calculation rooted in arrogance. "Now listen," Heller said, his tone shifting into oily persuasion. "I know your kind. You scouted for General Rowan Hale, didn't you? You're a civilized man. You understand business." With his free hand, he reached into his coat and produced a heavy leather pouch. It hit the ground at Koda's feet with a rich, tempting clink. $500 U.S. gold, Heller said. "That's more than the army paid you in 5 years. All you have to do is step aside." He gestured toward Clara without looking at her. "She's sick, friend. Hysterical. She doesn't know what's good for her. We're just taking her home. To get help." The canyon fell utterly still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Clara Whitlow stared at Koda's back, hardly breathing. The old fear crept in that every man had a price, that every protector eventually turned into a keeper of cages. Koda glanced down at the gold, then lifted his eyes to the agent. There was no hunger there, no hesitation. His gaze carried the same force as the storm that had torn through the canyon days earlier, something elemental beyond purchase. "She is not property," Koda said. His voice was low, steady, and it traveled the length of the ravine. "And she is not sick." He stepped forward straight into the line of fire. "And this place," he continued, sweeping a hand toward the towering red walls, "is not Boston. Your papers mean nothing here. Your judges cannot see into this canyon. You have no authority here except the wind." The agent's finger tightened on the trigger. "I'll shoot you where you stand, savage. You could try," Koda replied calmly. "But you might want to ask the men behind you if that's wise." The agent frowned and glanced back. The 2 trackers, sun-bleached, hard-eyed men, had not raised their guns. They were staring at Koda, at how he stood, at how the stone itself seemed to accept him. They knew him, not as a scout, but as a name murmured around campfires in the Dragoon Mountains. "I'm not doing this, boss," the older tracker said, easing his horse back. What the agent snapped. "That's Koda," the man muttered. "They say he walks through rock. That bullets don't bother him. I didn't sign on to fight a ghost, not for 500, not for 5,000. He turned his horse. "I'm out." The second tracker didn't argue. He followed immediately, spurring hard down the trail, dust boiling behind them. The agent stood alone. He stared at the retreating men, at the pouch of gold lying untouched in the dirt, then back at Koda, who had not blinked, not shifted, not yielded a step. The canyon's silence closed in. The wilderness suddenly felt immense, and he felt very small. Slowly he lowered the gun, spat into the dust a weak, final gesture. "Keep her," he snarled. "The desert will finish you both." He holstered his revolver, scrambled onto his horse, and rode after his men, vanishing around the bend. Koda watched until the hoofbeats were gone. Only then did he turn. The danger ebbed like receding floodwater, leaving quiet behind. Adrenaline drained from their limbs, hands trembling not from fear, but from what they had chosen to defend. The sun dipped toward the western rim, setting the sky ablaze. They climbed to the high mesa and stood where the land fell away into violet sage and distant peaks. Evening cooled the air, carrying the scent of juniper, and calm. Clara reached into her pocket and unfolded a worn sheet of paper. The map from Tucson, rail lines, town names, safe routes back to the world she'd fled, the plan that had once been her only hope. She studied it for a long moment. then lifted her eyes to the horizon. She unfolded the paper fully, but did not look at the lines or the cities or the way back. She held the map out over the cliff's edge and opened her hand. The wind seized the paper at once. It fluttered like a wounded bird, spiraling down, down, down into the deep shadows of the Arroyo del Diablo, where floodwater would one day carry it toward the sea. "I don't need this anymore," Clara Whitlow whispered. Koda stood beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. He watched the map vanish into the vastness below. "No," he asked quietly. "Then where are you going?" Clara turned toward him. The wind tugged free, her hairpins, letting her hair spill loose around her face. She looked at the man who had placed his body between her and a gun, then at the harsh, beautiful land that had nearly killed her before offering her shelter. "Nowhere," she said. A smile touched her lips. It reached her eyes. "I think I've finally arrived." Koda didn't answer with words. He reached for her hand. It wasn't the desperate bone-locking grip from the cliffside rescue. It was steady, warm, certain. His fingers threaded through hers, palm to palm, callous to skin. A grip of equals, a promise. In our mind's eye, the world pulls back, now leaving them there at the edge of everything. Two figures, outlined against the immense sky where the first stars were piercing the velvet dark. Below them, the river kept moving, carrying away maps, papers, and the past, leaving only what was true. Thank you for listening to this story. Before I go, I want to say one last thing. The holidays can be full of light, but for some, they carry memory or grief, or a storm of their own. If you feel like you're trapped in a canyon today, remember Clara. Remember that the water does recede. Remember that help can come from places you never expected. And remember, you are stronger than the current. From my family to yours, Merry Christmas. May your hearth be warm, may your heart be light, and may you always find a hand to hold in the dark. If this story brought you a moment of peace, please take a second to like this video and subscribe for more stories from the wild. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover, visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.